Kansas Territory, autumn of 1859. The morning was cold enough that the breath of the mule formed small clouds in the air as it was led down the center of the town's only street. The woman sitting on the mule's back was 26 years old. Her name was Clara Briggs. 8 hours ago, she had been asleep in the homestead she shared with her husband and 2 children on a quarter section of prairie 3 miles east of town. She had gone to bed a wife, a mother, a member of a community that knew her name and nodded to her at the general store and sat beside her at Sunday services in the small wooden church at the end of the street. She was now being paraded down like something brought to market. She was sitting backwards on the mule. This was deliberate. Facing the animal's tail rather than its head was a tradition older than the territory itself, imported from European shaming rituals and adapted to the frontier with the same practical efficiency that settlers applied to everything they carried west. Facing backwards meant she could not see where she was going. It meant she could see the crowd behind her, every face she recognized, every neighbor, every woman she had shared meals with, every man who had helped her husband raise the walls of their homestead. She could see all of them watching, and they could see her. Her head had been shaved. The hair that had reached the middle of her back that morning, brown and thick, the hair she braided every day and pinned beneath a bonnet when she worked the garden and let down at night when only her husband could see it, was gone. Cut first with shears and then scraped to the scalp with a razor by a man she had known for 3 years, a neighbor who had eaten at her table, who had held her youngest child at the baptism 6 months earlier, and who had volunteered to perform the shaving the way a man might volunteer to shoe a horse or mend a fence, a task, a community service. Her face and chest were black with pine tar. It had been heated in a pot over a fire behind the general store and applied to her skin with a broom handle while 2 men held her arms. The tar was not boiling. That distinction mattered to the men who applied it, who understood from experience or instruction that boiling tar would cause the kind of damage that might kill the woman before the punishment was complete. And a dead woman could not be paraded through town as a living warning to every other wife watching from her doorway. The tar was hot enough to hurt, hot enough to raise blisters on the skin beneath it, hot enough that Clara had screamed when it touched her chest, a sound that the crowd absorbed without visible reaction the way a congregation absorbs a hymn it has heard before. Over the tar, feathers had been pressed by hand, chicken feathers pulled from a sack that someone had filled that morning with the unhurried preparation of a person who had known this was coming and had planned accordingly. The feathers stuck to the tar and stayed. They covered her face, her neck, her shoulders, the exposed skin of her chest where her dress had been torn open to the waist to allow the tar to be applied directly. She looked like something between a woman and a creature, which was precisely the point. The transformation was the punishment's visual thesis. She had behaved like an animal. Now she looked like one. A man walked in front of the mule ringing a cowbell. Behind her, most of the town followed in procession, banging pots and pans, shouting, filling the cold morning air with a noise designed to accomplish 2 things simultaneously: to announce the procession to anyone not yet watching, and to drown out anything the woman on the mule might try to say. Children walked alongside the adults. Some threw handfuls of dirt. One threw a rotten apple that struck Clara's shoulder and stuck in the tar. No adult intervened. The children's participation was not incidental. It was educational. They were being taught what happened to women who violated the rules. They were being given a memory that would govern their behavior for the rest of their lives. Her husband walked at the front of the procession. He had organized this. He had requested it. He had gone to the men of the community 2 days earlier and told them what a neighbor had reported, that the neighbor had seen Clara speaking with a man from a homestead to the north, speaking with him near the creek that marked the boundary between their properties, alone, without her husband present, without explanation, speaking. That was the accusation, the full extent of the evidence. A woman had been seen talking to a man who was not her husband in a place where no one else was present. On the frontier, in a community small enough that every interaction was observed and every observation was interpreted, this was enough. The pipeline had been activated. And what was happening to Clara Briggs on the back of that mule was only the beginning. What was happening to Clara Briggs was not a spontaneous act of frontier rage. It was not a mob losing control. It was a ritual. A ceremony with a name, a history, a set of rules, and a social function as clearly defined as a wedding or a funeral, the charivari. The word came from medieval France, where it described a noisy procession organized to shame community members who had violated social norms. It crossed the Atlantic with European settlers and embedded itself in frontier culture, where it evolved into something more violent, more physical, and more devastating than anything its originators had practiced. But before I show you the full anatomy of this ritual and the pipeline of destruction it triggered for women like Clara, I need to dismantle an assumption you are probably making right now. You are probably assuming this was lawless mob justice, an extra-legal act committed by vigilantes in a territory where the law had not yet arrived. That assumption is wrong. What happened to Clara operated within a legal framework that explicitly sanctioned what was being done to her. Not in the shadows, in the open, in the light of a legal tradition that classified a wife's adultery as a fundamentally different offense than a husband's adultery, and that treated her body as property whose damage justified whatever remedy the owner saw fit to apply. Under the common law tradition that governed the frontier territories, a wife's fidelity was not an abstract moral principle, it was an asset, a commodity with measurable social and economic value that belonged to her husband. Her body was an extension of his property. Her sexual behavior was an extension of his reputation. When she violated her fidelity, she was not simply committing a moral transgression, she was committing theft. She was taking something that belonged to him and giving it to another man. And the legal system that governed the territories recognized this framework with a clarity that modern Americans would find staggering. A husband who punished a cheating wife was not, in the eyes of frontier law, committing assault. He was recovering damages. A community that participated in her humiliation was not conducting a mob action. It was enforcing a social contract that territorial law acknowledged even when it did not explicitly prescribe the methods. The nearest judge might be 100 miles away. But even when judges were present, they routinely deferred to community standards in matters of moral discipline, recognizing that frontier settlements maintained social order through mechanisms that formal legal systems could not replicate at such distances and with such limited resources. This meant that a woman accused of adultery on the American frontier faced a system that was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. The accusation activated a process. The process produced a punishment. The punishment produced a consequence that extended far beyond the morning on the mule. What happened to Clara Briggs after the tar was scraped from her skin and the feathers were pulled from her hair was worse than what happened during the procession. Because the procession ended, what followed did not. If you want to understand how a single accusation, sometimes true and sometimes invented, out of nothing more than malice or convenience, could destroy a woman's entire life through a pipeline as systematic and as inescapable as any we have covered on this channel, then you need to watch this video to the end. Subscribe right now. Hit that subscribe button, because what I am about to reveal is the machinery that operated behind the spectacle. The tar and feathers were what people saw. What they did not see was the system that turned a morning of public humiliation into a lifetime of destruction. To understand why the punishment of accused women was so extreme on the frontier, you need to understand something about the economics of reputation in a world where reputation was not a social nicety, but a survival mechanism. A frontier community in the 1850s or 60s was not a town in the modern sense. It was a cluster of homesteads and a handful of shared buildings, a general store, a church if they were lucky, perhaps a blacksmith, positioned in a landscape so vast and so indifferent to human survival that no single family could exist without the cooperation of its neighbors. When your barn caught fire, your neighbors came to help you rebuild. When your wife went into labor during a blizzard, your neighbor's wife walked through the snow to assist with the delivery. When raiders or rustlers threatened your livestock, your neighbors rode out with you to respond. These were not favors. They were obligations embedded in a social contract that every member of the community understood and enforced. You helped because you would need help. You were trusted because you demonstrated trustworthiness. And you maintained your family's reputation because reputation was the currency that purchased cooperation, and cooperation was the difference between surviving on the frontier and dying on it. In this economy, a woman's sexual reputation was not one asset among many. It was the foundation upon which her family's entire social position rested. A wife whose fidelity was questioned cast doubt on her husband's authority over his own household. A man who could not control his wife was a man whose judgment was suspect in every other domain. Could he manage his land? Could he manage his debts? Could he be relied upon in a crisis? The questions cascaded outward, from the bedroom to the barn to the property line to every interaction the husband had with every other man in the settlement. An accusation of adultery did not merely damage the woman. It threatened the economic and social infrastructure that kept the family alive. This is why the punishments were so disproportionate to what a modern observer would consider the offense. The community was not punishing sex. It was protecting the reputation economy that held the settlement together. Every man in the community had a stake in ensuring that the rules governing women's behavior were enforced publicly and severely, because every man's wife was a potential vulnerability in the same system. If one woman's adultery went unpunished, the implicit permission weakened the deterrent for every other woman. The punishment of Clara Briggs was not about Clara Briggs. It was about every wife watching from her doorway as the mule walked past, absorbing the lesson the procession was designed to teach. This is what happens. This is what we do. This could be you. The men who participated in charivari processions did not consider themselves cruel. They considered themselves responsible. They were maintaining the social order that kept their families safe in a world where safety was fragile and conditional and could be undermined by a single act of individual defiance. They banged their pots and threw their dirt and watched the tarred woman ride past on her mule and believed they were doing what decent people do when the rules that protect everyone are violated by someone too selfish to consider the pots. Consequences. That their definition of the rules applied exclusively to women's bodies and never to men's was not a contradiction they recognized. It was simply the way things were, the way things had always been, the way God and nature and common sense intended them to be. And it was within this framework that the pipeline operated, not as an aberration of frontier culture, but as its logical product. A system that valued women's bodies as economic assets inevitably developed mechanisms for punishing women whose bodies were perceived to have been misused. The mechanisms were brutal because the stakes were high. The stakes were high because the frontier made everything a matter of survival, and survival justified everything. The pipeline began with a word, not a trial, not an investigation, not a confrontation between accuser and accused where evidence was weighed and testimony evaluated. A word, spoken by one person to another, passed from mouth to ear in the general store or after church or across a fence line between properties, carrying a weight that no amount of denial could counterbalance once it had been released into the small, closed atmosphere of a frontier settlement. She was seen with him. That was the template. 4 words that could activate the entire machinery of punishment without any additional evidence being required. The accusation did not need to describe a specific act. It did not need to identify a time or place with precision. It did not need corroboration from a second witness. It needed only a credible source, meaning a male member of the community whose standing was sufficient to make his word difficult to challenge, and a target, meaning a woman whose circumstances made the accusation plausible or whose husband was inclined to believe it. The sources of accusation were varied, but they followed patterns that territorial court records reveal with uncomfortable consistency. Neighbors who had genuine grievances. A man who believed he had seen something through a window or across a field, something that might have been intimate or might have been innocent, but that looked suspicious enough from a distance to justify the conclusion he had already reached. Neighbors who had manufactured grievances. A man involved in a land dispute with a woman's husband, who understood that the most efficient way to destabilize a rival was to destroy the reputation of his wife. The accusation cost nothing to make, and the damage it caused was immediate and irreversible, regardless of its truth. Husbands themselves were among the most common accusers. A man who wanted to be rid of his wife faced limited options on the frontier. Formal divorce required access to a territorial court that might be weeks of travel away, and that charged fees a homesteader could not afford. Abandonment was possible, but carried its own social consequences. A man who simply left his wife invited questions about his own character that could damage his standing as surely as her alleged adultery would. But a man who accused his wife of infidelity and subjected her to community punishment emerged from the process not as an abandoner, but as a victim. He had been wronged. He had responded with the righteous anger the community expected. He retained the property, the homestead, the children, and the sympathy of his neighbors. She retained nothing. The accusation was, for a husband seeking exit from a marriage, the most cost-effective solution the frontier offered. The woman's ability to defend herself against the accusation was functionally non-existent. She could deny it. Her denial was expected and therefore meaningless. A woman who had committed adultery would naturally deny it. Therefore, denial proved nothing. She could provide an alternative explanation for whatever had been observed or alleged. The explanation was weighed not on its merits, but against the accuser's credibility. And since the accuser was typically a man of standing, and the accused was a woman whose standing was derived entirely from the husband who was now questioning it, the scales were permanently tilted. She could appeal to other women in the community for support. Other women were the least likely to provide it, not because they lacked sympathy, but because defending an accused woman meant associating yourself with her accusation, and association was contamination. A woman who stood up for Clara Briggs risked being asked what she knew about Clara's behavior, how she could be so certain of Clara's innocence, and whether her own conduct bore the kind of scrutiny that such certainty invited. The accusation was a door that opened in one direction. Once a woman walked through it, voluntarily or otherwise, the process on the other side could not be stopped by anything she said or did. Only a man could stop it. Her husband, by declaring the accusation false and accepting the social cost of calling the accuser a liar. A community leader, by intervening on her behalf and risking his own standing. A clergyman, by counseling mercy in a community that interpreted mercy as weakness. These interventions were possible. They were rare. They required a man to spend his own social capital to protect a woman whose social capital had already been declared worthless. Most men did the math and kept silent. The pipeline moved forward. Between the accusation and the punishment, there was a gathering. It was not a trial. Calling it a trial implies protections that did not exist. There was no presumption of innocence. There was no right to speak in your own defense. There was no impartial judge weighing evidence. There was a group of men sitting in a room deciding what would be done to a woman who was not permitted to participate meaningfully in the discussion about her own fate. The gatherings took place in whatever space the community used for collective business, a front room of a prominent homestead, the back of the general store. The church, on occasions where the clergyman supported the proceedings, which lent them a moral authority that the participants valued and the accused woman could not counter, the men of the community assembled. The accuser presented his account. The husband stated his position. Other men offered what they knew or what they believed they knew, or what they had heard from someone who claimed to know. The woman, if she was present at all, sat or stood at the edge of the room while her life was discussed in the third person by men who had already decided what they believed. Her husband's position determined everything. If he defended her, if he stood before the gathering and declared the accusation false and accepted responsibility for his wife's reputation, the matter could end there. Not cleanly. The accusation would linger in the community's memory, like smoke in fabric, impossible to remove completely. But the formal process would stop. The punishment would not proceed. The pipeline would be blocked at its second stage by the only barrier it recognized, a man's authority exercised on a woman's behalf. But if the husband believed the accusation, or wanted to believe it, or simply found it convenient to accept, the gathering moved from deliberation to sentencing with a speed that reflected how little genuine deliberation was involved. The men discussed not whether the woman was guilty, but what should be done to her. The punishments followed a hierarchy that was remarkably consistent across frontier settlements separated by hundreds of miles, suggesting a shared cultural inheritance rather than independent invention. Each community had learned the same rituals from the same traditions and applied them with variations that reflected local custom but not local creativity. The lightest punishment was public shaming without physical harm. The woman was brought before the community, and her accusation was read aloud. She was made to stand in a public place for a fixed period while the settlement's residents passed and observed her. This was rare. Most gatherings considered verbal shaming insufficient for an offense as serious as adultery, which meant that most proceedings escalated quickly to the physical punishments that formed the pipeline's core. The gathering decided which punishments would be applied and in what order. Head shaving, tarring, feathering, the Charivari procession, in extreme cases, branding or physical mutilation. The decisions were made by consensus rather than by vote, which meant that the most aggressive voices in the room set the tone, and the more moderate voices either agreed or remained silent, rather than opposing men whose anger gave them a moral authority that moderation could not match. A man who argued for mercy was a man who seemed to sympathize with adultery. A man who argued for severity was a man who was defending the community's values. The dynamics of the room made escalation the path of least resistance and restraint, the position that required the most courage to hold. The woman learned what had been decided either through her husband, who informed her with whatever emotional register he brought to the dissolution of his marriage, or through the men who arrived at her home the following morning to carry out the sentence. In some documented cases, the woman was given no warning at all. The first indication that the gathering had reached a verdict was the sound of men approaching her door. By then, the pipeline had already determined what would happen next. The only question was how long it would take, and how much of her it would leave intact when it was finished. The hair came off first, before the tar, before the feathers, before the mule and the procession and the noise that announced to the entire settlement that a woman was being unmade in public. The shaving was the opening act, the first physical transformation in a sequence designed to strip a woman of her identity one layer at a time until what remained was unrecognizable as the person she had been that morning. The significance of hair in 19th century America cannot be overstated. A woman's hair was the visible symbol of everything the culture valued in femininity: virtue, modesty, beauty, domesticity. Women spent hours maintaining their hair, braiding it, pinning it, covering it with bonnets in public as a gesture of respectability that was as socially mandatory as wearing clothing. A woman's hair was described in the language of the era as her crowning glory, the feature that most visibly distinguished her as female, as respectable, as someone whose appearance reflected the moral standing of her household. To remove it was not a haircut. It was an amputation of identity. The shaving was performed publicly. This was essential. A punishment conducted in private would have served the woman's interests by limiting her humiliation. The pipeline served the community's interests, which required maximum visibility. The woman was brought to a central location: the street, the yard of a prominent homestead, the area in front of the church or the general store. She was held in place by men if she resisted, which most women did, not because resistance could change the outcome, but because the body's instinct to protect itself does not consult the odds before it activates. Her husband, or a man designated by the gathering, wielded the shears first, cutting the length away in rough strokes that left uneven tufts close to the scalp. Then the razor, scraped across the skull with the same tool and the same technique a man used to shave his own face each morning, applied now to a woman's head with a practicality that treated the act as labor rather than violence. The hair fell to the ground where it lay in piles around the woman's feet. Some communities collected the hair and burned it publicly, adding the smell of burning to the visual spectacle. Others left it where it fell, to be scattered by wind and trampled by the crowd that would gather for what came next. The shaved head accomplished something that no other punishment could replicate. It made the accusation visible, permanent, portable. A woman with a shaved head in a frontier community where every face was known could not appear in public without carrying the evidence of what had been done to her and, by implication, what she had done to deserve it. She could not cover it effectively. A bonnet concealed the scalp, but the absence of hair beneath it was obvious to anyone who looked closely, and in a community of 50 or 100 people, everyone looked closely. The shaved head transformed her body into a public announcement that followed her everywhere she went for the months it took for her hair to regrow. And even after it began to grow back, the short, uneven growth that preceded full recovery was its own signal, marking her as a woman in the process of returning from a punishment that everyone remembered and no one would let her forget. The psychological damage of the shaving extended beyond vanity. The woman who looked in a mirror or caught her reflection in a window and saw a bald skull staring back did not see herself. She saw the person the community had decided she was. The transformation was designed to make her internalize the judgment, to believe that the creature in the reflection was the truth and the woman who had existed before the razor was the lie. Some women never recovered the sense of self that the shaving destroyed. They had entered the process as women who had been accused. They emerged as women who had been convicted, not by evidence or by law, but by a razor and a crowd and the sight of their own hair lying in the dirt at their feet. But the shaving was only the beginning. It removed her identity. What came next removed her humanity. Pine tar was the material of choice because the frontier had an abundance of it, and because its physical properties made it uniquely suited to the purpose of sustained punishment. Derived from the slow burning of pine wood, tar was a thick black substance used across the frontier for waterproofing roofs, sealing barrels, and coating fence posts against rot. It was available at every general store. It was cheap, and when heated over a fire until it reached a viscous liquid state, it adhered to human skin with a tenacity that made removal an ordeal lasting days. The tar was heated in a pot or a bucket over an open fire. The temperature was managed with a practicality that revealed how thoroughly the community understood what it was doing. Too hot, and the tar would cause third-degree burns that might kill the woman or leave her so severely injured that the rest of the punishment could not be carried out. Too cool, and the tar would not spread evenly or bond properly to the skin. The men who heated the tar had either done this before or had been instructed by someone who had. They tested the temperature the way a cook tests a pan, with experience and attention, adjusting the fire until the tar reached the consistency that would cause maximum pain without maximum damage. The distinction was important to them. They were not trying to kill her, they were trying to mark her. The woman's clothing was torn or cut to expose the areas where the tar would be applied. The extent of exposure varied by community and by the severity of the accusation. In some cases, only the head and face were tarred. In others, the clothing was torn to the waist, and tar was applied across the chest, shoulders, and back. The most extreme documented cases describe women stripped entirely, tarred from neck to thigh, the application covering enough of the body to make the woman appear less than human when the feathers were added. The exposure itself was punishment. A woman's body displayed publicly in a culture where female modesty was a moral absolute, was a woman whose most fundamental social protection had been revoked. She was no longer entitled to the privacy that defined respectable womanhood. Her body belonged to the community's judgment now. The tar was applied with a broom handle, a brush, or a ladle. It went on hot. The pain was immediate. First-degree burns on initial contact, blistering into second-degree burns where the tar pooled in the hollows of the collarbones, the creases of the neck, the sensitive skin of the chest. Women screamed. The accounts that survive do not attempt to soften this detail. They screamed with a sound that witnesses describe decades later with a specificity that suggests the memory never faded. The screaming was absorbed by the crowd. the way every other element of the punishment was absorbed, as part of the ritual, as evidence that the punishment was working, as sound rather than communication. Then the feathers. Handfuls of chicken feathers, goose down, whatever was available, pressed into the tar while it was still tacky. They adhered on contact and held as the tar cooled and hardened around them. The visual transformation was the point. A woman covered in tar and feathers no longer looked like a woman. She looked like something else, something between human and animal, something that the mind processed as grotesque rather than familiar. The transformation gave the crowd permission to treat her as something other than a neighbor, a mother, a person they had known. She had been converted into a symbol, and symbols do not have feelings that require consideration. The tar hardened as it cooled. Within an hour of application, it had bonded to the skin beneath it with a grip that could not be broken by pulling or peeling alone. Removal required turpentine, lard, or hours of careful scraping with a blade, each method tearing at blistered and burned skin that had already been damaged by the heat of application. Some women attempted to remove the tar themselves. Most could not. The pain was too severe, and the tar too firmly set. They needed help. They needed someone willing to spend hours carefully working the substance free, while the woman beneath it shook and wept and bled from skin that came away with the tar in strips. Finding someone willing to provide that help was itself a test. Helping a tarred woman meant associating with her. And association was contamination that most people on the frontier could not afford. The Charivari procession was the punishment's public performance, the stage where private judgment became community spectacle, and a single woman's humiliation was converted into a lesson that every person in the settlement would carry for the rest of their lives. The word Charivari came from France. On the frontier, it was called chivare, or rough music, or simply the ride, and it followed a template that varied in detail, but never in purpose. The tarred and feathered woman was placed on a mule or a donkey. The choice of animal was deliberate. A horse was a creature of dignity and usefulness on the frontier. A mule was a creature of labor and stubbornness. A donkey was a creature of comedy. Placing the woman on the lowest animal available communicated her new status in the community's hierarchy. She was beneath the horse. She was beneath the mule. She was an object being transported by the least respected animal the settlement could provide. She was seated backwards, facing the tail rather than the head so that she could see the crowd following her but not the path ahead. The symbolism was layered. She had turned her back on her marriage. Now she faced backwards on an animal too lowly to be called a horse. She had no control over where she was going. The man leading the mule controlled her direction, her speed, her destination. She was cargo. The noise began before the procession moved. Pots and pans struck with wooden spoons. Cowbells rung continuously. Tin horns blown until the sound filled the street and echoed off the wooden buildings. The noise served purposes beyond spectacle. It summoned anyone not yet present. It created an atmosphere of communal participation that transformed individual cruelty into collective action, making each person's contribution feel smaller and therefore more acceptable. And it drowned out the woman. A woman who could not be heard, could not plead, could not explain, could not appeal to the individual conscience of someone in the crowd who might, in a quiet moment, have felt the stirring of doubt about what was happening. The noise eliminated quiet moments. It eliminated doubt. It replaced both with rhythm and volume, and the comforting anonymity of a crowd making so much sound that no single voice within it could be identified or held accountable. The procession route covered the entire settlement, every home, every building, every property line. The mule was led slowly enough the residents had time to emerge from their doors and watch. Those who joined the procession fell in behind. Those who stayed in their doorways watched in silence that was itself a form of participation. Not protesting was consenting. Not intervening was endorsing. The community made its judgment unanimous, not through a vote, but through the simple physics of a crowd moving through a small town where there was nowhere to stand that was not either in the procession or watching it pass. Children participated. This detail appears in nearly every documented account of frontier charivari. Children walked alongside the mule. They threw dirt, rotten vegetables, small stones. They shouted words they had heard from adults, words whose full meaning they might not have understood, but whose emotional force they absorbed and replicated with the efficiency of young minds learning the rules of their world. No parent intervened to stop a child from throwing something at the woman on the mule. The children's participation was not an oversight. It was the point. They were being educated. They were learning what happened to women who broke the rules. They were being given a memory so vivid and so emotionally charged that it would shape their understanding of marriage, fidelity, obedience, and the consequences of defiance for the rest of their lives. The charivari was not just punishment of the accused. It was curriculum for the next generation. The procession ended where it began, usually at the center of town or at the edge of the settlement, where the road led out into open country. The woman was pulled or helped down from the mule. The crowd dispersed. The pots and pans went silent. And the woman stood in the street, tarred and feathered and shaved and alone, in a community that had just demonstrated with absolute clarity that she no longer belonged to it. What happens to a woman that a community has declared does not belong? Where does she go when every door is closed? Let me know in the comments, because the answer is the darkest part of this story. And it did not require tar or feathers or a mule. It required only silence. The punishments described so far, the shaving, the tar, the feathers, the procession, were the standard penalties applied across the frontier with enough consistency to constitute a shared tradition. But the pipeline had an extreme end, a tier of punishment that most communities did not reach, but that enough communities practiced to leave a documented record in territorial court files, military correspondence, and the accounts of frontier physicians who treated the aftermath. Branding, the application of a heated iron to a woman's skin, leaving a permanent scar in a shape chosen by the men who held her down. The practice was borrowed directly from livestock management, where branding served the practical purpose of identifying ownership and the symbolic purpose of establishing that the creature bearing the mark was property rather than person. Applied to a woman accused of adultery, the brand accomplished the same dual function. It identified her permanently as a woman who had been punished, and it confirmed, in scar tissue that would never fade, that her body was property whose owner had the right to mark it as he saw fit. The brands varied. Some were simple letters, an A for adulteress, applied to the forehead or the cheek where it could not be hidden. Some were crosses or other symbols whose meaning was understood within the community that applied them. The location of the brand was chosen for visibility or for cruelty or for both. A brand on the face ensured that every person the woman encountered for the rest of her life would see it and know what it meant. A brand on the chest or the breast carried a different message, marking the part of her body that the community considered the instrument of her transgression. Ear cropping appeared in territorial records with a frequency that suggests it was more common than branding, perhaps because it required less preparation and less skill. The practice involved cutting a notch or removing a portion of one or both ears with a knife or shears. Like branding, it was borrowed from livestock marking. Like branding, its purpose was permanent identification. A woman with a cropped ear carried the mark of her punishment visibly and permanently. She could grow her hair to cover it, but in a world where women's hair was routinely pinned up and where close-quarter social interaction was unavoidable in small communities, concealment was imperfect at best. Nose slitting appears in fewer records, but it appears. The practice had deep roots in European and medieval law, where it served as the prescribed punishment for female adultery in multiple legal codes across centuries. On the American frontier, it resurfaced in isolated cases documented in territorial court proceedings where the women or their advocates sought legal remedy after the fact. A knife drawn vertically through the cartilage of the nose, leaving a scar that bisected the face's most central feature. The wound healed badly. Frontier conditions offered no surgical repair. The scar contracted as it healed, pulling the nostrils and distorting the face into an asymmetry that marked the woman as visibly as any brand. These mutilations were not common. They were not the standard punishment applied to every accused woman across the frontier, but they were real. They were documented. They were performed by men who lived in communities that considered themselves Christian and civilized, and who attended church on Sundays and read scripture to their children and would have been horrified by the suggestion that they were capable of barbarism. They did not consider it barbarism. They considered it justice. A wife's body was property. Property that had been misused could be marked by its owner. The logic was simple enough to fit inside the framework that governed every other property relationship on the frontier. And once a woman's body was classified as property, there was no act of marking or modification that fell outside the owner's rights. The brand and the blade were not violations of the system. They were the system functioning at its most explicit. The procession ended. The tar cooled and hardened on her skin. The crowd went home to their suppers and their evening chores and the ordinary routines of lives that would continue as if nothing extraordinary had happened that morning. For the community, the punishment was complete. For the woman, the punishment was just beginning its longest and most destructive phase, the aftermath, the slow unraveling of everything that connected her to the world she had inhabited before the accusation. The most immediate consequence was expulsion from her home. Husbands who had initiated the punishment process rarely intended to continue the marriage afterward. The punishment was not correction. It was termination. The community had publicly confirmed that this woman was an adulteress, which meant that any man who continued to live with her was a man who accepted his own humiliation. No husband on the frontier could afford that. His standing among the men who had just helped him tar his wife depended on his willingness to complete the process by removing her from his household. The legal framework made removal efficient and total. Under the doctrine of coverture, which governed marital property rights across the territories, a married woman had no independent legal identity. She could not own property in her own name. She could not enter contracts. She could not sue or be sued. Her legal existence was subsumed entirely by her husband's. When the marriage ended through the informal mechanism of the charivari, rather than through formal divorce proceedings. The husband retained everything the law recognized as his: the homestead, the land, the livestock, the tools and furnishings and accumulated goods of their shared life, and the children. The children stayed with the father. This was not a custody determination made by a judge after weighing the interests of the child. It was a default outcome produced by a legal system that did not recognize a mother's independent claim to her own children. The children were assets of the household. The household belonged to the husband. When the wife was expelled, the children remained with the property they were legally attached to. A woman who had been tarred and feathered and paraded through town walked away from her home carrying whatever she could hold in her arms, leaving behind the children she had carried in her body. She did not say goodbye in some cases. She was not permitted to. The expulsion was immediate and complete, a clean severance designed to minimize disruption to the household that would continue to function without her. The woman walked. There was usually nowhere to ride because the horses belonged to her husband. She walked in the direction of the nearest settlement, which might be 10 miles away or 50, carrying whatever clothing or possessions she had managed to gather in the minutes between the end of the procession and her husband's order to leave. She walked with a shaved head that announced her status to anyone she met on the road. She walked with tar stains on her skin that days of scrubbing had not fully removed. She walked with burns that had not healed and would not heal properly without medical attention she could not access. She walked away from her children and toward a future that had been emptied of every resource, every relationship, and every form of social standing that might have made survival possible. The frontier was not kind to women traveling alone under the best circumstances. A woman with money, with a destination, with family waiting at the other end of the journey, still faced risks that made solo travel dangerous. A woman with nothing, going nowhere specific, visibly marked as someone her own community had expelled, faced something closer to a death sentence delivered in installments. Each mile took her further from the only life she had known. Each mile brought her closer to a destination she had not chosen and could not predict. And each mile made return more impossible, not because the distance was insurmountable, but because the community she had left behind had already closed the space she had occupied. Her absence was permanent before her footprints on the road had faded. Where did she go? The question is simple. The answer is a map of diminishing options that narrowed with each step until the only paths remaining led to places no woman would choose to enter voluntarily. Some women walked to the nearest settlement and attempted to disappear into a new identity, a different name, a fabricated history, a story about a husband who had died on the trail, or a family lost to fever. The strategy worked occasionally in larger towns where strangers arrived often enough that a new face did not automatically trigger suspicion. But frontier communities were small and interconnected. News traveled along the same routes that goods and mail traveled, carried by the same riders and wagon drivers who connected settlements separated by days of empty prairie. A woman expelled from one community for adultery frequently arrived at the next community preceded by the story of her expulsion. The reputation she was fleeing had outrun her. The doors she hoped to find open were already closed. Some sought refuge with relatives, a sister in another territory, a brother who had settled further west, parents back east who might take her in if the distance was not too great and the shame not too public. These refuges existed for women fortunate enough to have family willing to accept the social cost of harboring an accused adulteress. But the cost was real. A family that welcomed a tarred woman into its home invited the same scrutiny that had destroyed her. Neighbors would ask questions. The story would emerge. The contamination that frontier morality attached to sexual transgression did not respect family loyalty. It spread through association the way disease spread through contact. Many families calculated the risk and decided that blood was not thicker than reputation. The door stayed closed. The woman kept walking. Some found temporary shelter in the charitable institutions that were beginning to appear in the larger frontier towns by the 1870s and 80s, church missions that offered meals and beds to women in distress, benevolent societies organized by Eastern reform movements that had extended their reach westward along the railroad lines. These organizations provided survival, but not recovery. They could feed a woman and house her for days or weeks. They could not restore her reputation. They could not return her children. They could not undo the shaving or heal the burns or erase the memory of the procession from the minds of the people who had watched it. The charitable institutions were way stations, not destinations. The women passed through them and emerged on the other side, still carrying everything that had driven them there. And then there was the saloon, the pipeline we documented in the last video, the debt system and the dance halls and the cribs and the laudanum. For a woman expelled from a frontier community with no money, no family, no reputation, and no legal standing, the saloon was not a choice. It was the only open door in a landscape of closed ones. The saloon owners understood this. They watched for women in exactly this condition the way any predator watches for wounded prey, not with malice necessarily, but with a practical recognition that a vulnerable target requires less effort to acquire. A woman who had been tarred and feathered and expelled from her community arrived at the saloon already broken in ways that the pipeline's recruitment stage normally spent months accomplishing. Her social connections were already severed. Her self-worth was already destroyed. Her options were already non-existent. She was pre-processed, ready for immediate integration into the system at whatever stage her condition permitted. The adultery pipeline fed directly into the saloon pipeline. One system's discarded waste became another system's raw material. The community that had punished a woman for violating its moral code delivered her, through the mechanics of expulsion and the geography of limited options, into a system that would violate her in ways that the community would never have to witness or acknowledge. The men who had tarred Clara Briggs and paraded her through town on a mule could tell themselves that what happened to her afterward was not their responsibility. They had punished the sin. Where the sinner went after the punishment was her concern, her choice, her consequence. That the choices available to her had been reduced to one by the very punishment they had inflicted was a connection they did not make and did not want to make. The pipeline's genius was that it distributed responsibility so effectively that no single participant bore enough of it to feel the weight. Everything you have heard so far, the shaving, the tar, the feathers, the procession, the expulsion, the destruction of a woman's life from accusation to saloon, operated within a framework that applied exclusively to women. A husband who committed adultery on the American frontier faced none of it. Not the shaving, not the tar, not the procession, not the expulsion from his home, or the loss of his children, or the social annihilation that converted a respected member of the community into a nameless figure in a crib behind a saloon in a town where no one knew her real name. A husband who did exactly what his wife was accused of doing continued to live in his house, farm his land, raise his children, sit in church on Sunday, and look his neighbors in the eye without consequence. This was not an informal double standard maintained through social custom. It was a legal architecture built into the foundation of territorial law through a principle so deeply embedded in frontier culture that it had its own name: the unwritten law. The unwritten law held that a man who discovered his wife's infidelity was justified in responding with violence against the wife, against her lover, against both. The principle was never formally codified in any territorial statute. It did not need to be. It was enforced through jury verdicts that acquitted men who killed under its protection, with a consistency that made formal codification unnecessary. The law did not need to be written because everyone already agreed on what it said. The courtroom record across the Western territories in the second half of the 19th century tells the story with mathematical clarity. Men who killed their wives' lovers were tried and acquitted repeatedly. Across multiple territories and multiple decades, juries composed of men who understood the unwritten law because they lived inside the same system that produced it returned not guilty verdicts for defendants who had committed homicide in broad daylight with witnesses present. The defense was not self-defense. The defense was not insanity. The defense was that the victim had violated the defendant's property rights by interfering with his wife, and that the defendant's violent response was a proportionate exercise of his right to protect those property rights. Juries agreed. Judges allowed the defense. The system validated the principle that a man's honor, damaged by his wife's adultery, could be restored through killing. Men who killed their wives under the same circumstances received more varied treatment. Some were acquitted outright. Others were convicted of lesser charges, manslaughter rather than murder, and received sentences so light that they amounted to formal acknowledgement that the killing was understandable, even if it could not be fully excused. A man who beat his wife severely for suspected adultery was almost never prosecuted. A man who killed his wife's lover was almost never convicted. The unwritten law wrapped male violence in a legal immunity so comprehensive that frontier attorneys cited it by name in courtroom arguments, and judges permitted the citation without objection. Now reverse the genders. A woman who discovered her husband's adultery had no corresponding right to violence. A woman who killed an adulterous husband was charged with murder and prosecuted with the full weight of territorial law. No unwritten law protected her. No jury of her peers, which on the frontier meant a jury of men, extended to her the same understanding it extended to a husband in the identical situation. Her husband's adultery damaged nothing the law recognized as hers, because the law did not recognize her as an owner of anything, including her own dignity. His body was not her property. His fidelity was not her asset. His infidelity cost her nothing that the legal system was designed to measure. The asymmetry was total. A man's adultery was a private matter with no public consequences. A woman's adultery was a public crisis that justified tarring, feathering, branding, expulsion, and the complete destruction of her social existence. A man who responded to his wife's adultery with murder was protected by a legal principle so powerful it did not even need to be written down. A woman who responded to her husband's adultery with anything beyond silent endurance was a criminal. The pipeline that destroyed women accused of infidelity did not have a male equivalent because the system that built the pipeline did not consider male infidelity a problem requiring correction. It was simply the way men were, the way things had always been, the way God and nature and the unwritten law intended. The most devastating feature of the pipeline was not the tar or the razor or the procession through town. It was the fact that the entire machinery could be activated by a lie as easily as by the truth. The system did not distinguish between them. It was not designed to distinguish between them. It was designed to process accusations into punishments with maximum efficiency. The accuracy of the accusation was irrelevant to the mechanics of what the accusation produced. Territorial court records from Kansas, Colorado, Montana, and the Dakotas contain cases that reveal how thoroughly the pipeline could be weaponized by men who understood its power and were willing to use it for purposes that had nothing to do with fidelity. Husbands who wanted to dispose of wives they no longer desired discovered that a false accusation of adultery was the most efficient exit strategy the frontier offered. Faster than divorce, cheaper than legal proceedings, and infinitely more advantageous in its outcome. A man who divorced his wife through territorial court might be required to divide property or provide support. A man who accused his wife of adultery and subjected her to community punishment retained everything: the house, the land, the children, the sympathy of his neighbors, and a reputation enhanced rather than damaged by the process, because a man who had been wronged by an unfaithful wife was a man who deserved compassion rather than scrutiny. Some accusations were manufactured to serve land disputes. A man who wanted his neighbor's property understood that the most efficient way to destabilize a rival household was to destroy the wife's reputation. The accusation did not need to be believed permanently. It needed only to be believed long enough to activate the pipeline. Once the charivari had been performed, once the woman had been tarred and expelled, the damage to the husband's standing was done, regardless of whether the accusation was later questioned. A man whose wife had been publicly punished for adultery was a diminished man. His authority was compromised. His judgment was suspect. His position in the community's informal hierarchy had dropped. Acquiring his land at a reduced price or displacing him from a business arrangement became easier when his social capital had been gutted by a weapon that cost nothing more than a whispered sentence at the general store. Some accusations were retaliation. A woman who rejected the advances of a man who was not her husband discovered that rejection carried risks that acceptance would not have. A rejected man could accuse the woman of the very act she had refused to commit. The accusation punished her for saying no by publicly declaring that she had said yes. The cruelty was precise. The woman was destroyed not for what she had done, but for what she had declined to do. And her denial, the same denial that any guilty woman would offer, carried no more weight than if the accusation had been true. The pipeline did not pause to evaluate sincerity. It processed inputs into outputs, accusation in, punishment out. The woman's defense against a false accusation was the same as her defense against a true one, non-existent. She could deny. Denial was expected and therefore worthless. She could demand evidence. The system required none. She could appeal to her husband. If her husband was the accuser, this avenue was closed. If her husband was not the accuser but believed the accusation, this avenue was equally closed. She could appeal to other women. Other women could not help her without risking their own positions. She could attempt to flee before the punishment was carried out. Flight was interpreted as guilt, confirming the accusation more powerfully than any evidence could have. The pipeline consumed innocent women and guilty women with identical efficiency because innocence and guilt were categories the pipeline did not recognize. It recognized only the accusation and the sequence of responses the accusation triggered. A woman who had been faithful to her husband for every day of her marriage could be tarred and feathered and paraded through town and expelled from her home and separated from her children and delivered into the saloon system to be consumed over the following years, all because a single man spoke a single sentence that no one was required to verify and no one was empowered to challenge. The pipeline was a machine. Machines do not evaluate the quality of what is fed into them. They process it. Now let me take you back to Clara Briggs, to the mule and the cowbell and the black tar hardening on her skin in the autumn cold of Kansas Territory in 1859, to the crowd that followed her through town banging pots and throwing dirt, to her husband walking at the front of the procession with the posture of a man performing a civic duty rather than destroying the mother of his children. Clara's accusation was a conversation. A neighbor told her husband that he had seen Clara speaking with a man from a neighboring homestead near the creek that separated their properties. Speaking. The neighbor did not claim to have witnessed physical contact. He did not describe a compromising position. He described two people talking in a location where they could have been discussing a stray cow, a property boundary, a message that needed passing along. The neighbor described what he saw. Clara's husband interpreted what it meant. The community converted the interpretation into a sentence. And the sentence was carried out on the back of a mule, while Clara's two children watched from the doorway of the homestead she would never enter again. The tar removal took 2 days. Clara's sister, who lived on a homestead 12 miles east, came after hearing what had happened. She used lard and turpentine and a dull knife, working in small sections, peeling the hardened tar away from skin that had blistered and wept beneath it. The burns on Clara's chest and shoulders were severe enough that the skin came away with the tar in places, leaving raw patches that would scar permanently. Her sister washed the wounds with water she boiled on the stove and bandaged them with strips torn from a bedsheet. There was no doctor within reasonable distance. There was no medicine beyond what the homestead provided. Clara endured the removal in the same silence she had learned during the procession, a silence that was not composure, but the absence of anything left to say. Her husband sent her belongings to her sister's homestead in a single crate: clothing, a Bible, a hairbrush that had no immediate use. He did not send the children. Clara asked for them through an intermediary, a request that her husband refused without explanation and that the community supported without discussion. The children were his. The homestead was his. The life they had built together was his. Clara's share of that life was the contents of a wooden crate and the burns on her body and the memory of her daughter's face, watching from the doorway as the mule carried her past. Clara stayed with her sister for 3 weeks, long enough for the worst of the burns to close, not long enough for her hair to grow back. Her sister's husband tolerated her presence but made clear through the economics of his hospitality that the arrangement was temporary. An extra mouth required extra provisions. The neighbors had begun to ask questions. The contamination that Clara carried was approaching his household the way weather approaches across open ground, visible from a distance, impossible to stop, inevitable if she remained. Clara understood. She left before she was asked to leave, because being asked would have closed the last door that was still open to her, even partially. She walked west. What happened to Clara Briggs after she left her sister's homestead is not recorded in any document that has survived. Her name appears in no subsequent census, no territorial court filing, no church register, no death record, no marriage record. She entered the space that the pipeline created for every woman it processed, the space between the last known fact and the silence that follows. She was 26 years old, She had 2 children she would not see again. She had burns on her body that would mark her for whatever remained of her life. She had a shaved head that announced her crime to every person she passed on the road. And she was walking west into a territory where the only doors open to women carrying what she carried led to the same places we have already described in this channel: the saloons, the cribs, the pipeline behind the pipeline, the system that received what the community discarded and processed it until there was nothing left. Clara Briggs was one woman. The pipeline processed hundreds like her across the frontier territories over decades of operation. Women accused on evidence, women accused on suspicion, women accused on nothing but a neighbor's sentence and a husband's willingness to believe it. Each one shaved, each one tarred, each one paraded, each one expelled. Each one delivered into a future that had been emptied of everything except the options that no one would have chosen freely. The pipeline did not keep count. It did not need to. It was not a system that measured its output. It was a system that produced silence. And silence does not accumulate in numbers. It accumulates in absence. The towns that practice the charivari are American towns today. Some have grown into cities. Some remain small communities where the families that participated in frontier justice still own the land their ancestors homesteaded. The buildings where gatherings decided women's fates have been replaced by municipal offices and community centers. The streets where mules carried tarred women past banging pots and screaming children are paved now, lined with street lights and stop signs and the ordinary infrastructure of modern life. Nothing marks what happened on those streets. No plaque, no monument, no historical marker. Noting that on this spot in 1859 or 1863 or 1871, a woman was stripped and tarred and feathered and paraded through town for a crime that may or may not have occurred by a community that did not require evidence before it destroyed her. The punishment stopped, not because the communities that practiced them experienced a moral awakening, not because a law was passed banning the charivari, not because the men who heated the tar and wielded the razors looked at what they had done and recognized it as barbarism. The punishment stopped because the conditions that produced them changed. Territories became states. State law replaced community custom. Isolation gave way to connection as railroads and telegraph lines, and eventually, roads linked settlements to a wider world where the rituals of frontier justice could no longer operate without scrutiny from outside. The communities grew large enough that anonymity became possible. And in communities where anonymity existed, the reputation economy that had made a woman's fidelity a survival-critical asset lost its absolute power. The punishments became unnecessary, and so they faded. Not with a declaration, but with a silence that was indistinguishable from the silence they had always produced. But the foundations lasted longer than the rituals. The legal principle that a wife's body was her husband's property persisted in American law well beyond the frontier era. Marital exemptions to assault statutes, laws that explicitly excluded a husband's violence against his wife from the definition of criminal assault, survived in multiple states into the second half of the 20th century. The last American state to remove the marital exemption to its assault laws did so within living memory. The unwritten law that protected men who killed in response to their wives' adultery was invoked successfully in American courtrooms decades after the frontier closed. The legal framework that made the pipeline possible did not disappear when the tar pots were put away. It adapted. It softened its language. It replaced public spectacle with private suffering. But its core principle, that a woman's body was an asset whose misuse justified punishment by its owner, endured in statute and in practice long after the last charivari procession ended and the last mule was led back to its stable. Clara Briggs is gone. Her children are gone. Her husband is gone. The neighbor who made the accusation, and the men who heated the tar, and the women who watched from their doorways, and the children who threw dirt at a tarred figure on a mule are all gone. What remains is the ground they stood on, which does not remember, and the silence they created, which does not speak. But the silence is not empty. It is full of women whose names were erased by a system that did not consider their names worth preserving. Women who were accused and punished and expelled and consumed by the pipelines that waited for them at the end of every road leading away from the communities that had cast them out. They left no memoirs. They left no testimony. They left only the gaps in the historical record where their lives should have been. Gaps shaped exactly like women, visible only when you know to look for the outline of what is missing. If what you have learned today matters to you, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell because the stories hidden inside America's silences are the ones that most need to be spoken aloud. Share this video with anyone who has ever believed that frontier justice was rough but fair, because it was rough and it was never fair, and the people who paid the highest price for its unfairness were the people with the least power to resist it. Drop a comment telling me which part of this story you will carry with you, and tell me where you are watching from, because these women existed in every territory, and their story belongs to every generation that came after them. But the frontier was not the only place where women were punished for accusations that require no evidence and triggered consequences that could not be reversed. There is another chapter from another century and another continent where the same machinery operated under a different name with results just as devastating. That story is waiting for you right now. Click the video on your screen and discover what was buried next.